How dare you speak to me like that?
I am trying to resolve this, ma'am, please.
You think you can talk to me like that?
Have you ever been judged before you even had the chance to speak? Imagine stepping onto a plane, holding a valid first-class ticket, only to be told, by looks, by words, by silence, that you don't belong there. That was the reality for Jonathan Pierce, a black CEO who quietly owns the airline itself. In that moment, one simple seat dispute became a mirror of something much larger, who is seen as worthy and who is not. What would you do if it were you? Would you stay silent to avoid conflict, or would you rise risking public scrutiny? To defend your dignity, Jonathan chose the latter, and his choice shook an entire industry. This story isn't just about one man, one flight, or one insult. It's about every moment in life when someone tries to push you out of your rightful place. And it's about the extraordinary courage it takes to say enough. So, as you listen, ask yourself what seat in life is truly yours, and how far would you go to protect it? Stay with us, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss the story that redefined what dignity looks like in the sky. The morning air inside JFK International carried that familiar mix of coffee, jet fuel, and hurried footsteps. It was 7:30 a.m., the kind of time when business travelers moved like clockwork, laptops tucked under their arms, boarding passes clutched in hand. For most, it was just another flight. For Jonathan Pierce, it was supposed to be a quiet trip to London before a board meeting. Jonathan adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, the subtle fabric gleaming under the fluorescent terminal lights. He moved with the calm confidence of a man who had built his fortune from nothing. The son of a single mother in New Orleans, once the boy who had studied by candlelight when the power was cut. Now the CEO of Pierce Global Holdings. He had learned to carry himself with dignity no matter the room, no matter the audience. Seat 2A. That was his ticket. First class, checked in at 6 o'clock sharp. He had planned to read over notes during the 7-hour flight, maybe close his eyes for an hour before facing the intensity of another day. But as Jonathan stepped into the cabin of Aerosky Airlines Flight 212, he stopped cold. There, already seated in 2A, sipping champagne as if the glass belonged to her hand, was Margaret Whitford. She was a woman carved from wealth platinum blonde hair sculpted into a perfect bob, a cream-colored Chanel suit, and a handbag perched beside her worth more than some people's yearly salary. She didn't even glance up at Jonathan at first, fingers tapping her phone screen with mechanical precision. "Excuse me," Jonathan said evenly, holding out his boarding pass so she could see the large black numbers 2A. His voice was calm, polite, but firm. Margaret finally raised her pale blue eyes, sweeping him from head to toe. The pause was longer than it needed to be, thick with something unspoken. A faint smirk curled her lips. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," she said, her tone dripping with dismissive certainty. Then, as though it were nothing, she added in a voice loud enough for her companion beside her, "Some people always try to slip into seats they don't belong in." Her words landed like a knife, not shouted, not crude, but sharp with centuries of assumption buried beneath them. Jonathan stood still, the boarding pass steady in his hand. He had heard those words before, not always spoken aloud but whispered in boardrooms, disguised in hiring meetings, hidden in looks from across trading floors. They were words that said, "You don't belong here. Not you. Not someone like you." But Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. His silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. The morning sunlight streamed through the oval windows, illuminating Margaret's diamond earrings and the smooth glass of her champagne flute. Around them, the other first-class passengers adjusted headphones, glanced at newspapers, and now they began to watch. A few eyes flicked from Jonathan's tall frame 6'1", broad shoulders, skin the shade of polished mahogany, to the boarding pass he still held up. Proof that this was not imagination. "Ma'am," Jonathan said again, measured and clear, "that is my seat." Margaret turned back to her phone, the dismissal final, as if he were nothing more than an interruption. "I'm a Diamond Elite member," she murmured, her tone deliberately careless. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years. I'm sure they'll sort you out." Jonathan exhaled slowly. His heart wasn't racing. He had trained himself too long against that. But somewhere inside, the old ache pressed against his ribs. The ache of Harvard mornings when classmates questioned how he had gotten in. The ache of Wall Street meetings where he was mistaken for an assistant. The ache of proving, over and over, that excellence was never enough. From the corner of his eye, Jonathan noticed a flight attendant approaching. Daniel Brooks, the purser, smoothed down his Navy uniform as he walked with brisk professionalism. His smile was trained, his voice practiced. "Good morning, sir." "Is there an issue?" Daniel asked. Jonathan held out his boarding pass again, his tone steady. "Yes. Seat 2A is mine." Daniel glanced quickly at the pass, then at Margaret. And there it was, the subtle flicker in his eyes, the tilt of his body toward her, the instinctive deference to the woman already seated. "Of course," Daniel said, the words almost too polite. "Let me just check our system." He tapped at his tablet, the screen's glow reflecting against his furrowed brow. Seconds passed, then more. The silence grew. Margaret's smirk widened. Jonathan could read the story already. Diamond Elite, longtime passenger, preferred over the man who checked in at dawn. It wasn't about the boarding pass. It never was. Around them, the low hum of first class quieted. Coffee cups paused in midair. Earbuds were pulled out. The air thickened with that particular kind of tension. Everyone knew they were watching something more than a seating dispute. Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket, a calendar reminder for the board meeting scheduled in London at 5 p.m. He thought of the agenda, the contracts, the billion-dollar stakes waiting across the ocean. But here, in this narrow aisle at 35,000 feet waiting to happen, another kind of battle had begun. Let it play out, Jonathan told himself. Sometimes the truth has to show itself before it can be changed. The seconds stretched. Margaret leaned back in her seat as though the matter had already been settled in her favor. Jonathan remained standing, tall and unmoved, the quiet storm before the break.
How dare you speak to me like
This was
that?
not the first time Jonathan Pierce had been told he didn't belong.
I am trying to resolve this,
but it might be the last time anyone dared. Daniel Brooks kept his smile plastered on, but Jonathan could see the nerves in the way the flight attendant's fingers danced across the tablet. The device chimed softly as he pulled up the passenger manifest, his brow tightening with each scroll. Mr. Pierce. "I see here you checked in this morning at 6 o'clock, Daniel said, his voice bright in that artificial way people use when they know they're delivering bad news. "And Ms. Whitford, I see you're one of our Diamond Elite members with 20 years of loyal flying." He paused just a beat too long, and the pause told Jonathan everything. Margaret leaned into the silence with practiced confidence. "Thank you, Daniel. I'm sure this will be sorted quickly." Jonathan's jaw flexed, but his expression remained calm. He had been here before, in different clothes and in different rooms, the subtle weight of someone else's assumption pressing down, making you prove what should already be obvious. He held his boarding pass up again, clear as day 2A. Paid in full. Checked in hours before most passengers even arrived. Daniel cleared his throat. Mr. Pierce, sometimes early bookings and elite status create complications. I'll bring in my supervisor to make sure everything is handled appropriately. The words stung in their careful disguise. Complications. As though Jonathan's valid ticket was the problem, not the woman occupying his seat. He caught the way Daniel avoided eye contact, his gaze sliding back toward Margaret's serene composure. Jonathan knew then that this was not about boarding passes, not about systems. This was about who looked like they belonged in the front of the plane. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind already recording every detail, the wording, the expressions, the imbalance of courtesy. He didn't need to argue, he only needed to watch. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let people show their true colors. The murmur of the cabin began to grow. Business travelers adjusted their jackets, peered over newspapers. A mother hushed her toddler in row 3, though her eyes never left the scene. The air shifted, filled with that electric tension of strangers realizing they were witnessing something larger than themselves. Margaret crossed her legs, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Really? Mr. Pierce. Perhaps business class would be more comfortable for you anyway, she said sweetly, her words aimed to sound generous but landing like a blade. Jonathan didn't answer. He refused to give her the satisfaction of reaction. Moments later, Patricia Klein appeared from the galley. She was the ground service manager, summoned before takeoff for only the most pressing issues. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a crisp navy blazer, Patricia carried herself with the clipped authority of someone used to enforcing rules, not questioning them. What seems to be the problem here, she asked, her tone already suggesting she had picked a side before hearing a word. Margaret's hand shot up with performative relief. Patricia, thank goodness you're here. I've been flying with Aero Sky for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. I've already settled into my seat, and now, well, you see for yourself. Patricia nodded sympathetically before even glancing at Jonathan. Of course, Ms. Whitford. We value our Diamond Elite members. Then she turned toward him, her tone stiff, perfunctory. Sir, I understand you may be confused about the seating assignment. Let me see what I can do to accommodate you. The word hung in the air like smoke. Accommodate. It carried the implication that Jonathan was the intruder, the one being helped rather than the one whose rights had been violated. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. He handed over the boarding pass once more, his finger tapping the numbers with quiet finality. 2A, he said simply. Patricia's eyes flickered, but she recovered quickly, her voice smoothing into a practiced cadence. Yes, I see that. However, in cases where elite status and timing overlap, we sometimes prioritize our long-term loyal customers. We would be happy to offer you business class, along with a travel voucher for the inconvenience. The hum of whispers rippled through the cabin. The word echoed again, inconvenience, as though being stripped of dignity could be reduced to a minor hiccup in scheduling. Jonathan could feel the heat of every watching eye, but inside he was ice. He had weathered boardroom betrayals, media scrutiny, market crashes. This was different only in form, not in substance. Another attempt to push him out of a place he had every right to occupy. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his assistant reminding him of the London board meeting. He ignored it. There was more at stake here than numbers on a quarterly report. Patricia smiled tightly, already confident that the matter was resolved. Margaret lifted her champagne glass in quiet victory. Daniel shifted his weight, relieved to have passed the conflict up the chain. But Jonathan remained standing, unyielding. He could almost hear his mother's voice echoing from decades earlier. Never let them tell you where you don't belong. The silence in the cabin thickened, every second a slow twist of the knife. For the first time, Patricia's composure faltered. She hadn't expected him to resist so quietly, so firmly. In that silence, the roles began to blur. Margaret, once smug, now darted a glance around the cabin, aware that more and more passengers were staring. Daniel swallowed hard, sensing unease. Patricia tapped her tablet, stalling. And Jonathan. He simply stood, the quiet storm refusing to move, waiting for the next wave to hit, because he knew it would. And when it did, the stakes would climb higher than anyone in that cabin could imagine. The murmur in the cabin had risen to a quiet storm. Jonathan could feel it in the air, the weight of judgment, the tilt of authority pressing harder with every passing second. Patricia Klein stood rigid, her tablet still glowing in her hand, her lips moving as if rehearsing the words she would deliver to shut this matter down once and for all. But before she could speak again, a voice rang from the cockpit. "What's the delay here?" Captain Richard Hayes emerged, his cap tucked under his arm, his silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights. He was a man accustomed to command, his presence alone pulling the attention of both crew and passengers. His eyes flicked briefly to Jonathan, then locked onto Patricia. "We're scheduled for wheels up in 15 minutes, Hayes said sharply. "I don't want drama holding us on the ground." Patricia seized the opening. "Captain, we have a seating dispute. Mr. Pierce insists on occupying 2A, but Ms. Whitford is already seated. Given her elite status, I suggested we accommodate him in business class." Hayes glanced at Margaret, who sat as though the seat had been molded for her. Her smile was thin but confident, the look of someone who believed the world would always bend to her comfort. Business class should be fine. Shouldn't it? Hayes said, his tone not even questioning but final, as though he were already closing the matter. Jonathan's eyes never left the captain. With respect, "Captain, this is not a dispute. It's a matter of my purchased seat. 2A. He raised his boarding pass, calm as stone. Hayes frowned, irritation creeping into his voice. "Sir, we can't delay this flight over confusion. We have schedules, connections, weather windows. I need you to cooperate." The words sliced deeper than intended. Cooperate. As if Jonathan were the problem, the disruption, the inconvenience to be managed. Jonathan inhaled slowly, his voice low but unwavering. "I am cooperating. I am standing exactly where I was assigned to sit. What I am not doing is giving up my right to dignity." The cabin went still. Hayes's jaw tightened. His eyes swept over the onlookers, catching the gazes that refused to look away. He shifted, uncomfortable under the silent witness of dozens of passengers. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavier, firmer. From the rear of the cabin, a broad-shouldered man in plain clothes approached. A badge flashed briefly at his belt, his hand hovering near his holster. Air Marshal Edward Monroe. "Captain, do we have a security issue?" Monroe asked, his voice deep, the kind of tone meant to cut through confusion. Patricia gestured toward Jonathan, her words clipped. "This gentleman is refusing to accept reassignment." Jonathan turned slowly, meeting Monroe's gaze head-on. The marshal's eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man used to judging threats in seconds. Jonathan held his stare, unblinking, his presence steady. "There is no refusal," Jonathan said. "There is only a valid seat assignment that your staff is choosing not to honor." Monroe's hand twitched near his holster again, not quite drawing, but close enough that the implication rattled through the rows. A passenger gasped softly. Jonathan felt a surge of heat in his chest, not fear, but the weight of choice. He could yield, step back, take business class, and swallow the humiliation like he had so many times before. Or he could stand. not only for himself but for every unseen face who had ever been told in subtle and overt ways that they did not belong. His heart pounded not from panic, but from the clarity of the decision forming inside him. "Marshal," Jonathan said carefully, "I suggest you check my documents before you treat me as a threat." The firmness in his tone drew a ripple through the crowd. Margaret's smirk faltered for the first time. Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping the tablet screen in restless circles. But Hayes pressed forward, his voice growing colder. "Mr. Pierce, this flight cannot proceed with disruptions. If you don't comply, we may have to escort you off this plane."
How dare you speak to me like that?
Jonathan felt every eye on him now, the silence of the cabin suffocating and heavy. His pulse slowed, his mind sharpening. In that quiet, he heard the echoes of every door slammed in his face, every doubt cast on his abilities, every insult veiled in politeness. He knew exactly what was happening. The system, layer by layer, had closed around him. The purser, the ground supervisor, the captain, the marshal, all aligned, their authority reinforcing itself in one direction, against him. Yet inside, Jonathan felt a strange calm settle. It was not resignation, it was resolve. He looked at Monroe squarely. "If you want to remove me, do it after you verify the truth. Otherwise, you are not protecting this flight. You are protecting prejudice." The marshal hesitated. For the first time since he arrived, a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. Around them, phones began to rise higher, passengers angling to capture the scene. A woman in row 4 whispered, "This doesn't feel right." A businessman muttered under his breath, "He has the ticket." Why are they doing this? The tide was shifting, small but perceptible. Jonathan could feel it. Patricia's face flushed, her confidence slipping as the murmur of passengers grew. Hayes's expression hardened, but even he sensed the cabin was no longer behind him. Margaret's fingers gripped the armrest, her earlier smugness dissolving into unease. And Jonathan. He stood tall in the aisle, his voice low, deliberate, every word cutting through the tension like glass. "You can call this disruption, you can call it confusion, but what it truly is discrimination, and I will not be silent for it." The words hung in the cabin like a thunderclap. It was no longer a private dispute. It was a reckoning. For a moment, the cabin was nothing but silence, heavy and charged. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of light. Jonathan stood steady, the quiet center of the storm, while Captain Hayes and Patricia Klein exchanged quick glances, trying to decide their next move. Then came the soft click of a camera phone, a sound so small, yet it carried like a crack of thunder. From row 5, Clara Jennings angled her phone just enough to capture the scene. She had boarded the flight like any other passenger, a pair of earbuds tucked into her coat pocket, a notebook still peeking from her bag. A journalist by profession. Clara had spent years chasing stories about injustice, but rarely had the story walked straight into her lap, demanding to be told. Her hands were steady as she pressed "Go Live." Within seconds, the words pulsed across her screen, broadcasting on Twitter Live. The counter ticked upward, 20 viewers, 50, 100. She whispered into her mic, her voice barely above a murmur, but sharp with purpose. Breaking. Aerosky Airlines, Flight 212, passenger with confirmed first-class ticket, is being denied his seat. This is happening right now. Passengers turned, phones rising higher, the quiet tension now edged with urgency. Clara's voice continued, clear and measured. "The man is Jonathan Pierce." Yes, that Jonathan Pierce, the CEO of Pierce Global Holdings. The name rippled through the cabin. People straightened in their seats, eyes widening as recognition spread. Some whispered to each other, confirming what they had just heard. The billionaire investor, the philanthropist, the man who had spoken at the United Nations about equity in global markets. He wasn't just a passenger. He was someone whose decisions moved economies. And here he was, standing in an aisle, being told he did not belong. 2 rows behind Clara, Ryan Carter adjusted his baseball cap and leaned forward. Phone already recording for Instagram. He was a travel influencer, known more for breezy tips about hidden beaches and airline hacks than for capturing moments of confrontation. But Ryan knew content when he saw it, and he knew injustice when it unfolded in front of him. He pointed the camera at himself briefly, whispering with intensity, "Guys, you're not going to believe this. A black CEO, Jonathan Pierce, is being told to give up his seat. Look at this. He has the ticket in his hand, but they're siding with her." He shifted his camera toward Margaret Whitford, still perched in 2A, her expression souring as phones began pointing her way. Within minutes, Ryan's video was shooting through social media. Likes, shares, comments pouring in. People demanded answers, tagged Aerosky Airlines, filled the feed with hashtags, Your Seat 2A, On Justice for Jonathan, Our Flight 22. Jonathan felt the change like a shift in the wind. The walls of silence that had pressed so tightly around him began to crack. He wasn't alone anymore. Every camera lens was a mirror held up to the injustice, every live stream a spotlight burning through the facade of civility. Captain Hayes noticed it too. His jaw clenched as he realized control was slipping. He muttered toward Patricia, his voice low but edged with anger. "Get this under control before we lose the cabin." Patricia nodded briskly, then turned back to Jonathan. "Sir, this behavior." Her words cut short as Clara's voice rose, no longer a whisper, but firm and public. "Mr. Pierce, can I confirm you purchased seat 2A and checked in this morning?" Jonathan turned, his gaze steady. "Yes. Checked in at 6A, ticketed, paid in full." Clara angled her camera to show the boarding pass he held, zooming in on the bold letters 2A. Gasps rippled across the live stream, comments exploding in real time. "He's telling the truth." This is discrimination. Plain and simple. Unbelievable in 2025. Margaret shifted in her seat. Her face flushed as she realized the cameras weren't turning away. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm a Diamond Elite. I've earned this seat. He can take business class like everyone else." Ryan's voice cut through, sharp and incredulous. "Like everyone else, he paid for first class. Why do you think he doesn't belong here?" The words hung, dangerous and undeniable. Passengers shifted, murmurs rising louder now. Some nodded, others pulled out their phones to join the recording. The cabin was no longer silent. It was alive with judgment, and, for once, it wasn't pointed at Jonathan. Jonathan stood taller, not because he needed validation, but because he knew the narrative had shifted. For the first time in this confrontation, the weight of truth wasn't his alone to carry. Edward Monroe, the air marshal, stiffened as he noticed the cameras trained on him. His hand drifted away from his holster, the gesture suddenly exposed, no longer hidden behind the quiet of authority. Captain Hayes cleared his throat, frustration breaking through his calm. "We cannot operate a flight with this kind of disruption." But Clara's voice cut in once more. Firm, undeniable. "Captain, the disruption is not Mr. Pierce. It's your crew refusing to honor his paid ticket, and the world is watching." The words stung, their truth echoing across thousands of screens. The comments climbed, demanding accountability, tagging news outlets. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, the storm of memory returning. Times he had been silenced, overlooked, forced to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. But now, he felt the opposite. The weight was lifting, not because the fight was over, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. When he opened his eyes, they burned with calm fire. "I will not move," he said, voice steady, each word carrying like a bell. Not because of stubbornness, not because of pride, but because this is bigger than me. This is about dignity. A hush followed, deeper than before. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade under the gravity of his words. And in that silence, thousands of miles away, on phones and screens across the world, people leaned closer to listen. Jonathan remained standing, his boarding pass still in hand, though he no longer needed it as proof. Cameras had captured the truth. His name, his ticket, his seat, every fact was already flying across digital networks faster than the aircraft could ever move through the sky. Yet even as the tide turned, Jonathan felt the old ache rising within him. It was an ache born not in this cabin, but decades earlier. On cold school mornings in Chicago, when he was told he was too ambitious for his own good. It was the ache of professors at Harvard Business School calling him articulate with surprise, as though eloquence and his skin color were contradictions. It was the ache of boardrooms where his proposals had been second-guessed until repeated by someone who didn't look like him. And here it was again. Seat 2A, a chair no different in fabric or design than the others, yet treated as a throne that some believed he hadn't earned. Jonathan's breath slowed, his pulse steadied. He had lived long enough to recognize these moments when time seemed to stretch, giving him space to choose who he wanted to be. Behind him, murmurs grew louder. Clara Jennings's live stream viewer count had already doubled since takeoff preparations had paused. Ryan Carter's Instagram stories buzzed with comments that scrolled faster than he could read. Some passengers were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others leaned in, emboldened by Jonathan's words. Margaret Whitford, still occupying 2A, finally broke the silence with a scoff. "This is absurd. You're turning a simple mix-up into a circus. If he'd just accept the business class seat, we'd all be on our way." Jonathan turned his head slowly, his gaze calm yet unflinching. "You believe this is a mix-up because it costs you nothing. But for me, for people like me, these moments add up. They always cost." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her confidence faltered in the face of a truth too sharp to deflect. Captain Hayes shifted uncomfortably. His instinct screamed at him to end this quickly, but his training offered no path forward when the cameras made every move permanent. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Pierce, surely you understand. We must depart. Every minute of delay costs thousands of dollars." Jonathan looked at him evenly. "And every moment of humiliation costs lives in ways you'll never calculate on a balance sheet." The words struck not just Hayes, but the entire cabin. A hush followed, heavier than before. It was no longer about one man's seat. It was about the invisible tally of indignities borne by millions. Edward Monroe, the air marshal, felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. His training had prepared him to assess threats, to neutralize danger. But Jonathan wasn't a threat. He was a mirror, and what he reflected back was uncomfortable. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the boarding pass. He thought of his daughter, Layla, now 12 years old. He remembered her voice one night after a school recital, small and fragile. "Daddy, why did the teacher call me lucky to be so smart? Would she say that if I wasn't brown like you?" Jonathan hadn't known how to answer then. But he knew now. He would not move. Inside, he wrestled with the fear that always accompanied these stands. He knew the risks headlines twisted against him, accusations of arrogance, investors whispering about distractions. But he also knew the greater risk his daughter watching a recording years from now and seeing her father shrink when he should have stood tall. The cabin noise blurred. The passengers, the crew, even Margaret's sharp breaths faded into background. Jonathan was alone again in his mind, facing that choice: endure silently or act visibly. And then he remembered his father, a bus driver in the south side of Chicago who had worked long nights and longer mornings. A man who once told him, "Son, when they don't want you in the seat, you plant yourself anyway. You sit twice as firmly, because sometimes dignity is heavier than comfort, but it's always worth carrying." The memory burned like a coal in his chest. Jonathan exhaled, slow and deliberate. He spoke again, voice softer now, yet carrying further than before. "I didn't come here today to make a spectacle. I came to fly to Chicago, just like every one of you. But what happened here? It isn't about me alone. It's about every person who's been told they don't belong in a place they earned." Clara's camera shook slightly as she swallowed emotion. She knew a quote when she heard one. This wasn't just reporting anymore. This was testimony. Ryan Carter muttered to himself, though his mic picked it up clearly. This is bigger than a flight. This is history happening. Jonathan straightened, his frame tall against the narrow aisle. He folded the boarding pass carefully, slid it into his breast pocket, and clasped his hands in front of him. His choice was made. Margaret muttered under her breath, "Grandstanding." But for once, her voice carried no authority. Jonathan turned his eyes toward the front of the cabin. "Captain Hayes, I respect your responsibility to operate this flight, but you must also respect my right as a paying passenger. I will not be moved to another seat, and I will not accept vouchers in place of dignity." A ripple of applause broke from somewhere near row 10, tentative at first, then stronger as more passengers joined in. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough to shift the air, to signal where the weight of the cabin was moving. Patricia Klein's face paled. She realized they were losing not just control, but legitimacy. Her training had never covered this scenario, an uprising not of violence, but of conscience. Clara's live stream chat exploded. "Go, Jonathan. Stay strong. This man is all of us." Jonathan lowered his eyes briefly, letting the sound of applause wash over him. He wasn't a man who sought validation from crowds, but he recognized the rare gift of solidarity. For once, the weight wasn't his alone. And yet, even in that moment of support, he felt the shadow of uncertainty. He had made his choice, but what would it cost? Would the board of Pierce Global Holdings view this as a reckless display? Would shareholders recoil? Would rivals weaponize the moment? Jonathan inhaled deeply. Some battles carried costs, but he knew this. The greater cost was silence. The plane remained still on the tarmac. The passengers remained suspended between departure and destiny. And Jonathan Pierce stood, resolved, a man who had chosen dignity over convenience. The cabin felt like a held breath. Phones hovered, eyes fixed. The aircraft door was still open to the jet bridge, yet it was as if no air moved at all inside first class. Jonathan could hear the faintest sounds, the thin clink of Margaret's bracelet when she shifted, the soft whir of Daniel's tablet waking from sleep, the distant beep from a service cart being docked somewhere behind the curtain. He slipped a hand into his inside pocket and drew out his phone. Calm, deliberate, no flourish, just a decision quietly made. Edward Monroe's posture tightened. "Sir, please keep personal devices stowed until Jonathan met his eyes. Steady. In a moment. Marshall." He woke the screen with his thumb. The wallpaper was not a family photo, not a skyline, but a simple black field. One icon sat centered on it, stark and unbranded, as if it were meant for a different world than the one most passengers lived in. He tapped it once. The app opened to a biometric prompt. A ring of light traced the curve of his face. For half a second, nothing. Then the ring flashed green. A calm, synthesized voice filled the air, amplified just enough to carry. Biometric match confirmed? Welcome, Mr. Pierce. Patricia blinked. Daniel froze mid-tap. Captain Hayes's mouth went tight. The interface changed, lines of clean, utilitarian text sliding into place over a dark background. A header appeared at the top Aerosky Executive Command Suite. A soft ripple went through the cabin. Not a gasp. Exactly. More like a murmur of comprehension beginning to take shape. Clara tilted her camera to capture the screen. Her live-stream chat surged, comments flying past in a blur. Ryan whispered, "Oh my God," and forgot to hold his phone selfie style. He was filming Jonathan now. Entirely. Jonathan spoke clearly, almost conversationally, as if he were in his own conference room. Captain Hayes, Ms. Klein, for documentation and transparency. I'm entering an internal review protocol. He navigated with quick, practiced motions. A dashboard appeared. Flight ops, crew roster, passenger manifest, incident report, ground traffic liaison. His fingertip paused briefly over one tile labeled Command Overrides, then moved to another incident log. Sir, what is that application? Hayes asked, the edge in his voice struggling to hide a sudden tremor. Jonathan didn't look up yet. Aerosky's Executive Command Suite, restricted to officers authorized by the board. It exists to protect safety, customers, and the integrity of operations. He tapped again, including when bias compromises those operations. Margaret laughed once too high, too brittle. This is absurd. Some vanity app. None of this is the synthesized voice returned, neutral and absolute, executive authority verified. Jonathan D. Pierce, board-authorized executive, Tier 1. Margaret's laugh cut off as if a switch had been flipped. Daniel's tablet slid an inch in his hand. Patricia glanced at Hayes, then at the open cabin door, as if help might come walking through if she simply waited long enough. It didn't. Jonathan finally looked up. His voice softened. I don't intend to humiliate anyone, but we can't pretend this didn't happen. Every policy you quoted to me applies to a paid ticket in 2A. Mine. He lifted the phone slightly, not brandishing it, simply presenting the truth. So we're going to do this correctly. He tapped Command Overrides. The screen presented options with quiet finality, delay release, cabin hold, gate return, security flag, executive review. Jonathan pressed Executive Review. A low tone sounded through the aircraft's speakers, not the ding of a seatbelt sign, but a system tone most passengers had never heard. The synthesized voice spoke again, this time piped through the cabin PA in a crisp, non-judgmental cadence. Notice to crew. Executive Review Protocol initiated on Flight AS-22. All departure procedures placed on temporary administrative hold. Stand by for instructions from Executive Ops. A collective intake of breath moved down the aisle like a breeze. Hayes took a half step forward. Mr. Pierce, with all respect, we cannot depart while our process violates our own rules, Jonathan said. He turned the phone so Hayes could see the on-screen log filling in timestamps. Crew IDs, flight number, gate, seat assignment. Captain, I am recording this as a customer service failure with bias indicators. I trust you want this flight to leave in a way that doesn't expose your crew or this airline to more harm. Hayes's eyes flicked to the phones pointed at him, then to Edward Monroe, who suddenly looked like a man grateful not to be the one making the decision. Patricia tried to rally. Sir, there must be a more private way to address this. There usually is. Jonathan replied. But privacy is the luxury of systems that correct themselves. Ours didn't. He took a breath. Not to steady himself. He was steady, but to lower the temperature he could feel rising around him. We're not here to ruin anyone. We're here to fix what's broken. It starts with honoring what the boarding pass already settled. He tapped passenger manifest. 2 names glowed on the first-class grid 2A Jonathan Pierce. 2A override pending Whitford. Margaret. The software prompted resolve conflict. Jonathan let the prompt hang in the air. He turned, finally addressing Margaret directly. Ms. Whitford, I can't speak to how often you fly. I can only speak to today. You used language that implied I didn't belong. You insisted on a seat that isn't yours. This isn't about status. It's about what's right. For the first time. Margaret didn't reach for a retort. She looked small in a seat designed to project importance. Her gaze dropped to the carpet, to the tiny flecks of light woven into the dark blue. Jonathan tapped resolve. The system offered 2 buttons, reassign Whitford to booked seat, reassign Pierce. He didn't press either. He looked to Daniel. Mr. Brooks, will you confirm my ticket? Daniel swallowed. Yes, sir. He scanned the code with shaking hands. The tablet beeped. Green. Confirmed. 2A belongs to Mr. Pierce. Patricia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with professional resolve. Ms. Whitford, please gather your belongings. We'll escort you to your assigned seat. Margaret's mouth parted. This is humiliating. Patricia's voice gentled against her own discomfort. Ma'am, please. Margaret didn't move. The pause stretched, brittle. Then, with a stiff exhale, she lifted her handbag, slid the champagne flute onto the tray, and stood. The aisle seemed narrower now. Cameras tracked her as she stepped out. She offered Jonathan a glance that could have been fury or shame, or both. He did not return it with triumph. He offered only the courtesy of a small incline of his head, a nod that said, "Let's not do this to each other again." She moved past him, and the cabin exhaled. Jonathan turned back to the phone. The executive review panel now showed a new option. Lift administrative hold. He didn't press it. Not yet. He toggled to incident log and dictated, his voice even. Careful. Precise. Executive note. Bias indicators observe deference to perceived status over paid documentation. Use of coded language implying illegitimacy. Escalation to security despite passenger compliance. Corrective steps underway. Additional training recommended for involved staff. Request independent audit of first-class boarding procedures on AS-212 route for last 6 months. He ended the dictation. The system rendered his words into text in real time, tagging the flight number and crew IDs. Clara's voice drifted from row 5, soft but clear enough for her audience. Viewers, you're seeing a corporate mechanism most of us didn't know existed used for accountability in real time. This is extraordinary. Ryan's stories were a cascade of speech bubbles now, his whisper carried to no one and to everyone. He's not flexing. He's fixing. Captain Hayes smoothed a crease on his sleeve that didn't exist. Mr. Pierce, he said, choosing each word, if we can complete this review promptly, we can depart with minimal delay. Jonathan nodded. That's the goal. He glanced toward the cabin beyond first class. These people have places to be. He toggled back to command overrides, thumb hovering over lift administrative hold. He paused again and looked to Patricia. Ms. Klein, you will log a formal apology to the passenger for the denial of service and to the cabin for the delay. Not to satisfy me, but to set the tone we want on board. Respect first. Patricia's throat worked. Yes, sir. And Mr. Brooks, Jonathan added gently. I could see you wrestling with this. I expect you to learn from today. That would be the best outcome." Daniel nodded, eyes bright with something like relief. "I will, sir." Jonathan tapped, "Lift administrative hold." Administrative hold lifted. The voice announced, "Proceed with standard departure procedures." A little sound rose, small claps, a few unguarded cheers, then the embarrassed smiles of business travelers not used to clapping on airplanes. It wasn't celebration so much as gratitude. Gratitude for a wrong set right, without a scene of vengeance. Jonathan tucked the phone away. He turned to seat 2A, the space finally and simply what it had always been his seat. He didn't drop into it. He rested a palm lightly on the headrest and stood one more moment with the cabin watching. "Before we go," he said, "I want to be clear. This isn't about winning a seat. It's about setting a standard. Dignity is not a perk. From now on, it flies with us." No one moved. Even the engines seemed to wait. Then Jonathan sat. He fastened his belt. He folded his hands over his lap, and for the first time since stepping on board, he allowed himself to breathe like a passenger. The cabin's hum returned in thin threads, seatbelts clicking, a hushed cough, the faint sigh of conditioned air. But beneath those sounds was something heavier, a presence that hadn't been there before. It was the sense, shared by 47 strangers, that they had just witnessed a door open onto the machinery of power, and the hand that opened it had chosen restraint over spectacle. Jonathan didn't recline. He sat upright in 2A, his shoulders squared, gaze level. He wasn't finished, not with the flight, and not with the lesson. Captain Hayes stepped half a pace closer, a man trying to retake control without appearing to grasp for it. "Mr. Pierce," he said, voice measured, "thank you for lifting the hold. We can be on our way promptly." "We will," Jonathan answered, "after we do one thing right." He unbuckled, slowly, deliberately. He stood again. No one told him to sit. Even the air marshal remained still, hands visible, eyes careful. Jonathan turned slightly so his voice would reach beyond first class. "Folks, I appreciate your patience. Before we depart, I'm going to address what just happened, directly and plainly. Then we'll fly." He let the words settle, making space for breath, space for dignity. He turned first to Daniel Brooks. "Mr. Brooks," he said gently, "I watched you try to be helpful under pressure. I also watched you defer to status over a boarding pass. Tell me, what did you feel in that moment?" Daniel's jaw worked. He looked down at the tablet he still cradled like a shield, then up at Jonathan. "I felt the clock, the push to launch on time, and I thought if I can move one person quietly, the problem goes away." His voice dropped. "I knew it didn't feel right. I did it anyway." "Thank you," Jonathan said. "You naming that pressure over principle is where we change." He turned to Patricia Klein. The ground manager's posture was military straight again, but her eyes were not. They had that too bright shine of someone keeping emotions in the lines. "Ms. Klein, you invoked loyalty tears. You implied the system was complicated." Patricia swallowed. "Sir, elite passengers, they're vocal. They escalate. We're trained to diffuse, and the shortest path often looks like accommodation. Accommodation for whom?" Jonathan asked, calm as a plumb line. Patricia exhaled the answer. "For the person we think can hurt us most." A murmur moved like soap across water through the rows. Truth had a sound when it entered a room, a soft, collective, "Oh." Jonathan nodded once. "That, right there, is a bias engine. It dresses as pragmatism. It runs on fear." He pivoted to Captain Hayes, the pilot's chin lifted by instinct, the old armor of command. "Captain," Jonathan said, "you pressed punctuality. You were not wrong that time matters. Tell me what you weighed against it." Hayes's eyes flicked to the phones, then came back to Jonathan. A pilot's voice, when honest, could be a steady thing. I weighed schedule against conflict. I chose schedule. I thought calm meant compliance. He paused, and the silvery hair at his temple caught the cabin light. I did not weigh dignity. That's on me. Silence, not empty. Respectful. Jonathan looked to the air marshal. Marshal Monroe. You approached prepared to enforce? What did you see? Monroe's features softened almost imperceptibly, the way stone softens when it meets water long enough. I saw a man refusing a directive, and I saw a pattern I didn't want to name. I let my training speak first. I let my judgment speak second. Which one was right? Jonathan asked. Monroe's answer came without the usual federal hedging. The second. Jonathan nodded again, letting the admission stand as its own correction. He turned last to Margaret Whitford, now seated several rows back in the first-class cabin, her posture rigid, fingers clenched white around the edge of her armrest. Cameras tilted, but Jonathan didn't look to the lenses. He kept his eyes on hers. Ms. Whitford, he said, voice neither sharp nor soft. You said some people don't belong. I'd like to know what you meant. Not why you said it. What you meant. Margaret's lips pressed together, then parted. For a long moment, nothing came. When words did arrive, they were quiet, stripped of the lacquer. I meant I'm used to being first. I'm used to being believed. A swallow. I assumed that seat was mine to defend. And what would it have cost to check? Jonathan asked. She looked at her hands. Less than what it cost not to. There it was. Not contrition scripted by counsel. Not a publicist's line. Just the clumsy architecture of an honest answer, unattractive. Real. Jonathan faced the cabin, not as a CEO now, but as a man speaking to other people who would be people long after the plane touched down. I've made bad assumptions in my life,
to me like that?
he said. I've let fear call itself
I am trying
urgency.
to resolve this, ma'am, please.
I've let comfort rename itself policy. A slight smile at the corner of his mouth, small and human. I've also had strangers give me one more minute than I deserved. Those minutes changed me. He took a breath. I'm going to ask for 3 minutes from all of you now. No one objected. He turned to Clara Jennings. Ms. Jennings, you've been recording. Would you be willing to tell your audience something about witnessing, not just reporting? Clara lowered the phone a fraction, enough to speak not to her lens, but to the room. Witnessing, she said, choosing her words like tools, means letting the truth be seen, even when it makes everyone uncomfortable, including you. It means not looking away when a pattern shows up dressed as a one-off, and it means remembering the camera isn't the power. The people in the frame are. A soft breath of approval passed through the cabin. It wasn't applause. It was assent. Jonathan nodded to Ryan Carter. Mr. Carter, social amplifies. What do we owe each other when stories blow up? Ryan's voice came a little shaky. At first he was used to beaches and boarding hacks, not summits of ethics. We owe context. We owe reminding folks not to turn people into villains for sport, and we owe attention after the viral moment ends. Change isn't a story. It's many boring steps after the story. The older man in 1C, who'd been reading a print newspaper of all things, said, to no one and to everyone, amen to boring steps. Light laughter washed nerves off faces like warm water. Jonathan looked back to Daniel. You felt the clock. Next time. What do you do with that feeling? Daniel didn't hesitate this time. I check the pass first. I name the pressure out loud. I ask for help before I hand out harm. And if someone higher than you tells you to look away, Jonathan asked. Daniel's chin lifted a notch. I say no, or I ask for it in writing. Patricia's mouth curved with something like pride at that. She knew a spine when she saw one, even if it meant she'd answer for it later. Jonathan turned to Margaret again, giving her the dignity he demanded of her. "And you, Ms. Whitford." Next time a seat is contested, Margaret's eyes were glass-bright. "I asked to see the pass," she said, "and if I'm wrong, I move. The first time, a beat. I apologize the first time." He inclined his head. "Thank you." Jonathan shifted to address the full cabin. "We could have turned this into punishment theater," he said. "There are easier ways to play to a crowd than asking for reflection. But I don't want fear to run this airline. I want standards, too." He tapped his chest lightly, above the pocket where the boarding pass now lay. Standards start small, saying, "Show me the pass," saying, "We can wait one more minute for what's right," saying, "I will not escalate just to end discomfort." He glanced at Hayes, saying, "We depart on time when we depart with our values intact." Hayes gave a single, crisp nod. Understood. Jonathan drew a quiet line under it. "We're going to document today, train from it, and audit where this happens unseen. But in this cabin, this morning, we've done the most important piece already. We told the truth about what we did and why." He let the words land. He let them breathe. A woman from Coach leaned into the aisle, voice earnest, curious. "Sir, what if we don't have an app like you do? What do the rest of us do when we're the only ones saying it's wrong?" Jonathan met her eyes. "Find one other person," he said. "Look them in the eye and say, 'Will you stand with me for 1 minute?' People are braver in pairs than alone. Fear relies on our isolation. Dignity travels better with company." The woman pressed her lips together, nodding like she'd put that sentence in her pocket. Jonathan turned back to 2A and rested his hand once more on the headrest. "I'm going to sit," he said softly. "Then we're going to fly." He paused, looked to Margaret, to Daniel, to Patricia, to Hayes, to Monroe. "We will make mistakes again, all of us. Let's make new ones. Not this one." Something eased then. The coil in the room unwound, not with a snap, but with a long exhale. Shoulders lowered, eyes softened. Even the baby in row 8, who had been pre-crying for 10 minutes, decided the world could go another 20 without protest. Jonathan sat. The belt clicked. He set his phone screen down on the armrest. Dark now. The black glass a mirror reflecting only a sliver of overhead light. Captain Hayes found his voice first, and it was steadier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the PA, professional but warmer, "thank you for your patience. We're cleared to depart. Today we'll aim for a smooth ride. We'll also aim for something better than smooth." He glanced at Jonathan. "We'll aim for right." Daniel moved down the aisle with new hands, the small, courteous movements of his job now charged with meaning. "Welcome aboard," he said to a passenger he'd said it to 1,000 times. Today, it sounded like he meant it. Patricia lingered a beat near 2A. "Mr. Pierce," she said, voice quiet enough for just him. "I will file that apology, and I will file the training request as if my own name depends on it." "It does," Jonathan replied, not unkindly. "We all do." Edward Monroe took one last look around, then stepped back, his stance relaxed, palms visible. The posture of authority when it chooses to protect, not to intimidate. Clara lifted her phone again, eyes bright, voice low. To everyone watching, she whispered to her thousands, "Don't just share the outrage, share the repair." Ryan capped his recording with a line he hadn't scripted. "Dignity isn't trending," he said, "but it should be." The cabin lights softened for departure. The door sealed with a solid, satisfying thunk. The engines rumbled, then thrummed with intention. The aircraft, heavy with people and story and the weight of a better standard, began to push back. Jonathan closed his eyes for 2 breaths, He pictured his daughter hearing about this one day and feeling not just pride, but permission to hold her ground with kindness sharper than any blade. When he opened his eyes, the runway stretched ahead, bright lines cutting a path through morning haze. The plane rolled forward, gathering speed, the city falling away beneath a rising wing. The engines deepened into their climb, pressing every passenger back into their seats as the aircraft left Denver soil behind. The city lights shrank to a scattering of amber threads, the mountains dim silhouettes under dawn. Inside the cabin, though, the air held more light than shadow. What had begun as humiliation was now something heavier, stranger, and far more enduring, a collective recognition that history could happen in rows of reclined seats and folding tray tables. Jonathan sat upright, belt fastened, his breathing finally aligning with the steady pulse of the engines. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a sip of water. It wasn't relief he felt, but something older, deeper, the burden of choice having been carried, set down, and replaced with a new one. Because the truth was, the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part would come next, in boardrooms, in news cycles, in the echo chambers of opinion. Margaret sat in her reassigned seat, 2 rows back, staring out the window as if the clouds could forgive her more gently than people. Her hands remained clasped, not around her phone, not around a glass, but simply together like a woman relearning stillness. Daniel moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency, his posture straighter, his smile less rehearsed. Patricia hunched over her notes, already drafting an apology statement in her head, trying to get the words right before corporate reviewed them. Hayes focused on his instruments, but his jaw loosened for the first time all morning, a man privately grateful he had admitted the truth aloud, and the passengers, dozens of them, sat with an unusual silence, not the silence of boredom, not the silence of fatigue, but the silence of reflection. Phones buzzed with push notifications from networks already spinning the story. Clara Jennings, phone still in hand, whispered into her live stream that she'd just filed the first 500 words of her article from Seat 5C. Ryan Carter clipped together a sequence of footage that would pulse across social media within minutes, Jonathan standing, the override app glowing, Margaret rising to leave 2A. And that one-line dignity is not a perk. From now on, it flies with us. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. Behind them, images flickered, his daughter Layla laughing in their kitchen, his father's hands gripping a steering wheel through midnight shifts, boardrooms filled with sharp voices and sharper doubts. He thought about what it meant that a single confrontation in a single cabin would ripple outward to thousands, maybe millions. He thought about whether that ripple would bend toward justice or simply toward noise. A soft knock on his armrest brought him back. Clara had approached, her phone lowered now, her face earnest. "Mr. Pierce," she said quietly, careful not to intrude. "Off the record, why now? You've surely faced things like this before. Why choose today to make a stand so visible?" Jonathan studied her, the sincerity in her eyes. He answered in a voice even softer than hers. "Because my daughter is old enough to see the news on her own now. If she sees me back down, she'll believe silence is survival." "I'd rather she believe dignity is—" Clara's lips parted, and for a moment the seasoned journalist had no words. She simply nodded, stepped back, and returned to her seat, wiping the corner of one eye as if to brush away cabin dryness. Margaret stirred suddenly, standing halfway and catching Patricia's eye. She whispered something, too low for the rest to hear, then sat back down.
How dare you speak to me like that?
Patricia walked the short aisle to Jonathan,
I am trying to
bending
resolve
discreetly.
this, ma'am, please.
"She'd like to apologize," Patricia said, privately, "but she doesn't know how." Jonathan considered. "Then tell her this apology isn't performance. If she means it, I'll hear it. If not, silence is better. Patricia inclined her head, returned the message. Margaret gave the smallest nod, then turned again to the window. It wasn't resolution, but it was the first unpracticed gesture of humility. An hour passed. Coffee was poured. Trays clicked into place. The flight settled into the rhythm of altitude, yet the weight of what had transpired remained. Jonathan reached for his phone again, not to wield authority this time, but to send a message. His thumbs tapped Layla. I'll tell you the whole story tonight. For now, know this: your dad didn't move, and he didn't need to shout to be heard. He hovered over send, then pressed. A voice crackled overhead the pilot, warm, steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Smooth skies ahead. Thank you for flying with us this morning. A pause. Then, almost unthinkably, Hayes added, and thank you to one passenger for reminding us that sometimes smooth skies mean more than weather. The cabin stirred with soft chuckles, with nods, with an ease that hadn't been there before. Jonathan exhaled, let his head rest briefly against the seat. He knew this wasn't over. A storm of headlines awaited in Chicago. Questions of shareholders, reporters, political voices claiming him as symbol or target. But here, above the clouds, he let himself be simply a man who had chosen to carry dignity heavier than comfort, and who had found, to his surprise, that strangers were willing to help him carry it. The plane droned on, silver in the morning sun, a vessel not only of passengers, but of proof that even at 34,000 feet, the ground of principle was worth standing on. The wheels kissed the runway at O'Hare with a firmness that reminded everyone aboard they had, after all, been in an airplane. The cabin jolted gently, brakes humming, wings flexing, outside the oval windows. The Chicago morning stretched wide gray light, scattered clouds, and the gleam of terminals waking into a weekday rush. But inside, it was not just another landing. The passengers knew it. The crew knew it. Jonathan knew it most of all. As the plane taxied, phones buzzed in a steady chorus. Notifications bloomed across screens, news alerts, trending hashtags, live clips already cut and packaged for millions who hadn't been there. Seat 2A blinked in blue letters across Clara Jennings' feed. Ryan Carter's reel had been reposted by half a dozen influencers within the hour. Headlines were appearing before the aircraft reached the gate. CEO confronts airline bias mid-flight. Passenger overridden by app dignity or disruption. Exclusive viral showdown at 34,000 feet. Margaret sat rigid in 3A, the glow of her own phone reflected on her pale face. She scrolled furiously, saw her own profile photo splashed in threads she hadn't written, her name paired with words she had spoken, but wished she could pull back. She locked the screen, placed the device face down, and folded her hands. For the first time in years, silence felt like survival. Daniel Brooks busied himself with final checks, his voice a touch steadier now as he reminded passengers to remain seated. Yet his mind ran faster than his hands. He knew training modules would soon carry his name as case study, his hesitation, his compliance, his admission. It terrified him. It also freed him because, in a strange way, he knew exactly what to do next time. Patricia Klein adjusted her blazer, lips moving as she rehearsed the apology she had promised Jonathan. Not for the cameras, not for corporate spin, but for herself. She hadn't planned to be reshaped at 35,000 feet, but reshaped she was. Captain Hayes guided the plane to its gate, his voice steady over the PA. Welcome to Chicago. For those making connections, we wish you safe travels. For those concluding your journey, thank you for flying with us. We hope today gave you more than transportation. Some passengers chuckled softly, Others simply nodded. The words lingered, heavier than a routine farewell. The seatbelt light pinged off. Passengers rose, stretching, retrieving bags. Yet no one surged forward. The aisle remained still for a moment, as if unspoken agreement had been struck. Let Jonathan leave first. Jonathan unbuckled, rising with deliberate calm. He reached for his bag, but paused, letting his eyes travel the length of the cabin one more time. What he saw wasn't faces, though there were many, but witnesses. And in their eyes, he saw recognition. Some saw courage, others saw reflection, still others saw themselves. He stepped into the aisle. Clara Jennings angled her camera low, catching him without intruding, her journalist's instincts tempered by something more reverent. Ryan Carter whispered into his phone, "He's walking off. But this isn't the end. Trust me." At the aircraft door, Patricia stood waiting, her expression taut with professionalism but softened with sincerity. "Mr. Pierce," she said quietly, "on behalf of the crew and the company, I apologize. For the assumption, for the escalation, for the harm." Jonathan studied her face, saw no performance there. He inclined his head. "Thank you. Make sure it doesn't stop here." She nodded, the words settling into her as both charge and challenge. Captain Hayes met him with a pilot's salute, half formal, half personal. Jonathan didn't return it with the same gesture, but he offered his hand. Hayes took it, a shake, brief and firm, sealing not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Edward Monroe, the air marshal, lingered a step back, hands clasped. He spoke low, almost to himself. "Judgment before training. I'll remember that." Jonathan gave him a look that said more than words. "See that you do." The jet bridge hummed underfoot as Jonathan walked toward daylight, but daylight wasn't waiting quietly. At the end of the corridor, the glass walls revealed a sight that made even him pause a crowd. Cameras raised, microphones clustered, flashes already sparking. Airport police stood at intervals, not for danger, but for control. Signs lifted by hands read, "We stand with Seat 2A, and dignity flies with us." The story had not just spread, it had ignited. Clara Jennings slipped past him, already recording. "We're live at O'Hare, where Jonathan Pierce has just disembarked Flight 212 into what's become a national flashpoint. Stay with us. This is unfolding fast." Ryan Carter's voice cut in from another angle. "If you thought this ended in the cabin, you were wrong. The terminal is packed, the story is global, and the man at the center is about to walk straight into history." Jonathan paused at the threshold. For a second, he considered retreat, letting handlers manage, letting lawyers advise, letting silence shield. But then he thought of Layla again. Thought of her reading the headlines, seeing the footage, watching not just what he did on the plane, but what he would do after. He squared his shoulders, stepped forward, and the flashes erupted like lightning. A reporter's voice rang above the din. "Mr. Pierce, was this personal or political?" Jonathan stopped just long enough to answer with clarity. It was human, and that makes it everyone's. The words cut through the noise, sharp and unspinnable. They traveled faster than the cameras, faster than the crowd. Within minutes, they would appear in headlines, replayed on loops, dissected in panels. Jonathan moved on, his bag slung over his shoulder, his stride unhurried. The storm was only beginning, but he had already weathered the worst gust the choice to stand when silence would have been easier. And as the terminal swallowed him in its noise and light, he carried with him the certainty that one man's seat could become every person's stand. The first thing Jonathan felt beyond the camera flashes was the cold edge of the terminal's air on his skin, a reminder that the world outside a pressurized cabin could be sharper, louder, less forgiving. Microphones pushed forward. Questions collided in the space between faces and lenses. "Mr. Pierce, are you calling for a boycott? Will Aerosky discipline the crew? Are you suing or are you settling? Was this staged to build your brand? He didn't flinch. He stopped at a rope line, set his carry-on down, and lifted one hand, not to silence, but to ask for order. When the room finally found a breath, he gave them words measured for clarity and built for travel. This morning wasn't a performance. It was a correction. I paid for a seat that was mine. I stood for a dignity that is everyone's. What happens next is not about punishment. It's about standards. A hush fell that wasn't quiet so much as attentive. Someone lowered a boom mic an inch. A reporter mouthed the word standards as if testing it for weight. Jonathan continued, voice even, almost gentle. I'm heading to a meeting with Aerosky leadership within the hour. We'll address accountability. We'll also announce a set of reforms I've advocated privately for years. Today made it clear they can't wait. He did not take questions. He didn't need to. He gathered his bag and walked. A corridor of airport glass showing his reflection multiplied, a man becoming the message he had spoken. Security ushered him through a service door to a private elevator, then into a conference center just off the terminal. Inside, a table weighted glossy wood, water pitchers, legal pads, along with a half-dozen faces that read a shorthand of industry power.
How dare you speak to me like
Aerosky's
that?
interim CEO, Linda Park, General
am trying to
Counsel,
resolve this,
Michael
ma'am,
Trent,
please.
Chief Operating Officer, Fareed Rahman, Head of Customer Experience, Ann O'Rourke. Their postures said two things at once, welcome and braced. Jonathan, Linda said, standing. He spared her the ritual. Let's do the work. They sat. Counsel slid a folder across the table, initial statements, risk assessments, a proposed timeline that felt like a long hallway inside a burning building. Jonathan didn't touch the folder. He folded his hands. Here's what I'm putting on the table, and what I'm expecting on the record before we're done. He enumerated, not like a man reciting demands, but like an engineer reading specifications that would make the machine run true. First, universal anti-bias training, live and scenario-based, for every employee ground, cabin, cockpit, corporate, within 90 days. Not a module, a practice. You'll measure completion and comprehension. You'll publish both. Second, an independent anonymous reporting system for passengers and employees to flag discrimination, with guaranteed response times, third-party review, and consequences tied to annual evaluations and bonus structures. Third, the boarding pass validity protocol. Ticketed seat assignments are the final word. Elite tiers and last-minute pressures do not override documented rights. Every deviation requires written authorization and audit. Fourth, elevate equity to the level of authority. We create a chief equity officer with veto power over operational decisions that implicate dignity. They report directly to the board. They can stop a departure when policy and principle diverge. Fifth, transparency. We publicly affirm passengers' right to document interactions in non-secure areas as long as safety is not compromised. Sunlight must be a feature, not a threat. Sixth, audits. Mystery passenger programs across routes. Independent observers ride along, and results are summarized quarterly for the public. Seventh, repair. A standing fund for remediation covering not just vouchers, but counseling, time lost, and legal support for passengers harmed by discriminatory treatment. We name it for what it is, a dignity fund. He stopped, not because he had exhausted his list, but because the room needed to breathe. Silence pressed in. Linda's eyes flicked to counsel, to operations, back to Jonathan. You're asking us to move an aircraft carrier in a harbor full of cameras. I'm asking you to build the harbor you claim to sail, he replied, calm as weather. You say safety, service, respect, make respect measurable. Counsel cleared his throat. The training is doable. The protocol will anger some elite customers. The transparency policy will provoke unions and stir legal questions. Then let it provoke, Jonathan said. You can manage anger. You can't manage rot in the dark. Fareed leaned in, elbows on the table. A man who had counted gate minutes like beads on a string for 20 years. What about on-time performance? We live and die by it. You live and die by trust. Jonathan answered, on-time matters until it costs the public's belief that your time is worth their dignity. Set a standard and you'll get both back. Anne spoke softly, a steadiness under her words. And the people our crew's today's video is already reshaping them in comment sections they don't control. We invest in them, Jonathan said, not by shielding them from consequence, but by training them toward competence, by giving them permission to say, we can wait one more minute to do this right. If they feel the clock more than the compass, that's on leadership. The room exhaled. Linda looked at the ceiling as if searching for stronger lighting. Then she looked back and nodded. Once we do it, she said, all of it. We'll model it for the industry or we'll be buried by it. I'd prefer the former. Counsel scribbled, then caught himself and simply typed. The COO cracked the knuckles of a plan already forming. The head of customer experience pulled out a pen she saved for documents that would outlast everyone at the table. Jonathan allowed himself a small smile, the kind that appears when something impossible decides to walk towards you. Good, he said. We go public in 2 hours. 2 hours became 90 minutes. Communications spun a press conference out of thin air, a podium with 3 microphones, a backdrop with AeroSky's logo pared down to a quieter blue. The crowd gathered as if summoned by weather. Backstage. Jonathan checked his phone. A reply from Layla blinked in a bubble. I'm proud of you. Also, you owe me ramen tonight. He chuckled one short, grateful sound and typed back, deal. Extra noodles for extra courage. Linda stepped to the podium first. This morning, on one of our flights, AeroSky failed to meet its own standard. We prioritized speed over fairness, perception over proof. For that, we apologize to Mr. Jonathan Pierce and to every passenger who expects better. We are not here to spin. We are here to change. She outlined the 7 points. Cameras flashed on every verb. A few gasps rose at the words veto power. The phrase dignity fund slid into notebooks and headlines with a weight that would not lift quickly. Then she stepped aside, and Jonathan took the microphones. He didn't rouse, he tuned. His voice carried like a bell in a fog, clear, locatable. Airlines talk about lift, thrust, drag, and weight, he began. But there's another physics to flying, how dignity moves through a cabin. Invisible does not mean inert. When you disregard it, flights feel longer. When you honor it, even delays feel shorter. People can wait for a plane. They cannot be asked to wait for their personhood. He let a breath fall into the space between sentences. The room leaned. This morning, a boarding pass settled the matter that bias complicated. A protocol could have prevented the problem that people created. The reforms you just heard are not favors to me. They are anchors for everyone. A reporter called out without waiting. Mr. Pierce, are you forgiving the crew? We are not trading forgiveness for accountability. He answered. We're pairing them. That is how adults and institutions grow. Another voice. Are you concerned about shareholder backlash? I'm concerned about the cost of not doing this, he said. Trust is the most expensive asset we misprice. Ask any airline what happens when the public decides you don't deserve their patience. Are you calling for industry-wide change? Yes, he said simply, I'm calling for the same standard from every carrier. And to make it plain, Pierce Global Holdings will make our training curriculum and reporting framework open source. Use it. Improve it. Hold us to it. The murmur that followed wasn't skepticism. It was recognition. He continued, softer now, more intimate than the size of the room should have allowed. I stood this morning because I remembered being a boy told to shrink. I stood because my daughter is old enough to see how I carry myself when the cost is public. I stood because the flight attendant in me, yes, there's one in me too, knows the clock can be a bully if you let it. And I stood because a woman in coach asked me what to do when you're alone. Here is my answer again. Find one other person. Courage likes company. He stepped back. He had nothing more to add, because there was nothing to gild. Linda returned, took a handful of questions that would keep lawyers employed for months, and ended the conference on the only note that sounded true. Hold us to what we said. Back in the conference room, a smaller meeting waited. Not cameras, people. Daniel Brooks stood just inside the door, uniform crisp, eyes rimmed with a lack of sleep he hadn't earned and would remember anyway. Patricia Klein stood beside him, posture erect, hands folded the way people fold them when they are holding their own names carefully. Captain Hayes came last, hat under his arm, expression frank, relieved of performance. Jonathan closed the door, not to keep the press out, but to let the moment in. I asked for accountability, he said. That includes me. I flew without identifying myself to see the truth you live every day. What I saw was people making familiar mistakes under familiar pressures. What I expect now is not penance. It's practice. Daniel spoke first. I don't want this to be the story people tell about me, he said. I want the next story to be the one where I stopped it at the pass. Then write it. Jonathan replied, you'll mentor 5 new attendants through the protocol. They'll carry your lesson further than any clip will. Patricia lifted her chin. My apology went out, she said. It won't be my last action. I'm rewriting the gate escalation checklist. The first step will be verify boarding document. The second will be name the pressure allowed. The third will be ask for help. The fourth will be, do not trade one person's dignity for another person's comfort. Hayes exhaled. I told the truth in the cabin. I'll tell it again here. I let the schedule run me. I won't do that again. I'm adding a captain's briefing line item values check. Once before pushback, once after arrival. 2 questions. Did we do it right? If not, what will we fix before we fly back? Jonathan felt the quiet click inside. That sounds like alignment. Good, he said. None of this makes you saints. It makes you professionals. A knock at the door. Clara Jennings peeked in, not with a camera up, but with a notebook closed. Off the record, she asked, what do you hope people feel tonight when the clips end? He considered. Seen, he said, and responsible. She nodded, as if filing a feeling into the public record was as sacred as filing a fact.
How dare you speak to me like that?
Policy drafts multiplied. Legal teams parsed language.
Trying to resolve this, ma'am,
Comms
please.
watched sentiment graphs rise and level. Ryan Carter posted a final reel from a quiet corner of the terminal, a montage that ended not on Jonathan's face, but on a tray table where a boarding pass lay under a palm with a simple caption. This is where it should have ended. And now it can't. Evening came like a mercy. Jonathan stepped into the cool air outside the terminal, the kind of air that reminds a body it is not just a statement, but a living thing requiring rest. A black sedan waited. He slid in, loosened his tie for the first time all day, and let his head sink back. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number arrived. Ms. Whitford here. You were right. It would have cost less to check. I will do better before I am asked next time. Thank you for not making a spectacle of me when you could have. I'm sorry. He read it once. He read it again. Not to savor it, but to honor it. Then he typed a reply that fit the scale of the moment and the scale of their shared humanity both. Thank you for saying so. Make it real where there are no cameras. Safe travels. The car pulled away. Chicago blurred by in streaks of light. He pictured Layla at the kitchen counter, bowl waiting, chopsticks drumming a drum roll for ramen. He smiled. The day had been heavy, but not crushing. He had carried what he could and handed the rest to systems that would either prove themselves or be remade. He rolled down the window a crack and let the city sound in. Horns, a distant train, footsteps that belonged to no story but the one the walker was living. That, too, was a kind of dignity, a life proceeding without spectacle, with enough room to be ordinary. Back at the terminal, a maintenance crew entered Flight 212. They wiped down armrests and tray tables. They checked seat belts that had been fastened and unfastened through a long morning. One of them paused at 2A and ran a cloth a second time, not because it needed it, but because the seat had been more story than seat for a few hours, and now it was returning to service. His partner asked why the extra pass. He shrugged. Just felt right. And somewhere in headquarters, a training module went from draft to scheduled, and a checklist got a new first step, and a dashboard gained a field called Dignity Event with a drop-down that read Prevent, Correct, Repair. Jonathan closed his eyes. The car turned toward home. Tomorrow would be louder in some rooms and quieter in others. He had no illusions that a speech or a policy had finished anything. But he had faith that they had started something that could outlive the clip. He whispered to the night as if to a cockpit at altitude. Smooth skies are earned, he said. Let's earn them. The story of Jonathan Pierce teaches us that dignity is not a privilege, it is a birthright. Too often, society disguises bias under the mask of procedure or priority, quietly asking people to accept less than what they deserve. But true change begins the moment someone refuses to surrender their rightful place. For older audiences, this lesson resonates deeply. Many of us have lived long enough to remember doors that were closed, jobs denied, or respect withheld because of who we were or who others thought we were not. Jonathan's story reminds us that silence protects nothing. It only extends injustice. By calmly asserting his right, he created space not just for himself, but for generations to come. In our everyday lives, whether in families, communities, or workplaces, we can choose to uphold dignity, our own and others. That means standing firm when fairness is questioned and offering courage when others feel small. Even small acts of recognition can ripple outward, reshaping the world. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Never confuse peace with silence. True peace is built on justice, and justice begins with the courage to stand. Thank you for sharing your time and heart with us today. Stories like this matter because they reflect not just one man's journey, but the struggles and hopes we all carry. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of courage, dignity, and change to light. Together, we can keep these conversations alive.